The story of a medieval assassin doesn't begin in darkness or elegance. It begins in filth, in a rain-soaked alley behind a butcher's stall, where flies outnumber coins and survival tastes like rotten bread. You didn't choose this life. It chose you the moment your family died of fever, or your village was raided, or your lord decided you were worth more as a corpse than a servant. You became an assassin not for honor, but because there were no more doors left to knock on. There were no schools, no sacred brotherhoods, no monks handing out daggers and Latin phrases. You learned how to kill because someone taught you once, maybe a mercenary, maybe a thief, or maybe you just figured it out the first time you stuck a rusted nail into a man's neck and realized you didn't flinch. Your resume was a collection of scars, quiet kills, and the fact that you still had a pulse while others didn't. Your clients weren't kings in shadowy halls. They were merchants with too much to lose, knights with a rival in their way, or bishops too cowardly to commit their own sins. The offers came quietly in dark corners of taverns, with no names, only whispers. There's a man who needs to vanish. If you accepted, you didn't ask why, you didn't ask when, you just did it. You weren't dressed in sleek black leather stitched by tailors. Your cloak smelled of damp straw and sweat. Your boots were second-hand. The dagger you carried had a nick in the hilt where someone tried to break it, or maybe where someone tried to break you. You didn't look like a killer. You looked like a nobody. And that was the idea. No one notices a nobody until it's too late. Your kills weren't clean. There was no art, no poetry, only a chokehold in the dark, or a knife slipping between ribs when the guards weren't looking. Sometimes you pushed a man from a rooftop. Sometimes you slipped poison into a goblet and prayed no one noticed the color change. You didn't kill with flair. You killed with panic, fast, ugly, and desperate. And when the job was done, you didn't linger. You didn't collect applause. You vanished through sewer grates, over rooftops, through woods where no path existed. You left the blood and the questions behind. And if someone ever asked you what you did for a living, you lied. I tan hides. I dig ditches. I'm nobody. Because saying the truth would buy you a noose. If you're still with us, good. This journey is only beginning, and it's not the glamorous path you've seen in stories. It's brutal, it's lonely, and it's soaked in more fear than fame. Make sure you subscribe to Medieval Nocturnes if you enjoy diving into these forgotten lives. The ones buried between the footnotes of history. There's much more to uncover. You weren't recruited with ceremony. There was no grand initiation, no silver blade presented beneath torchlight. You were noticed, that's all. Maybe you won a tavern brawl without spilling your drink. Maybe someone saw you gut a thief in an alley without blinking. Or maybe, most often, someone simply knew you were desperate. Desperate people make excellent tools. They don't ask questions, and they rarely expect to survive. The ones who hired you never called it assassination. They said a favor, a matter of discretion, a correction. They passed you notes sealed with wax you weren't supposed to read, but you always did. You needed to know what you were walking into, because no one else would save you if it went wrong, and it almost always did. You didn't get blueprints or maps, you got rumors. The Baron sleeps in the tower, but sometimes takes a lover in the stables. There's a crack in the wall behind the chapel. The guard at the east gate drinks too much. These weren't strategies, they were guesses. You stitched together plans out of tavern gossip and hope, and then came the waiting. You could spend days in the shadows, watching, not moving, not breathing too loudly. You might pose as a beggar outside the manor gates, your face covered in false sores, hands trembling not from sickness but from anticipation. Or you'd pose as a stable hand, mucking out filth with a dagger hidden in your boot, listening for when the target walked alone. Killing wasn't the hard part. Killing was fast. What broke you was the silence before, the ache in your legs, the hunger in your belly, the icy certainty that one wrong blink could end everything. Assassins didn't fear death. They feared getting caught alive, because if they caught you, they didn't just kill you, they made it a warning. Stripped naked, dragged through the square, tied to wheels, split at the joints, or strung upside down with your insides on display. They called it justice, but it was theater, a bloody play designed to teach others that shadows don't win. And your name, if anyone knew it, would be spat on, then forgotten. You didn't kill for glory. You killed because it was the only thing you could still do that people would pay for. You were an invisible worker in a violent economy where silence was gold and blood was currency. No one asked about your past. No one cared. Your story ended the moment you took the job. You were no longer a person. You were a tool, and if the tool broke, it was thrown away. The moments before a kill stretched longer than time had any right to. You stood behind a rotten hay cart, pressing yourself into shadows that barely concealed your breath. You counted footsteps, watched torches bob through the gloom, studied the way your target rubbed his neck when he was nervous, or how he always paused at the third step when climbing to his chambers. These details mattered more than steel. Your palms were never dry. Not once. No matter how many times you'd done this, the moment just before the blade always felt like drowning. Not because of guilt, you had none left, but because the margin for error was thinner than a sewing thread. One cough, one creaking board, one glance over a shoulder, and your life unraveled. And yet, hesitation killed faster than any blade. So you moved, quietly, always lower than the eye line, through kitchens full of boiling stew and shouting servants, or across snow-covered roofs that snapped underfoot like dry twigs. You slid through holes in the wall meant for cats and children. You blended into processions, markets, even funerals. There was no honor in how you got close. You disguised yourself as a drunk, a priest, a limping cousin. You cleaned chamber pots for 2 days just to gain access to the servants' corridor. You whispered prayers you didn't believe, just to earn trust you didn't deserve. And always, always, you watched. For the moment when the guards looked away, when the candle flickered out, when your target was alone, when the moment came, there was no ceremony, no monologue, no slow motion strike, just the soft crunch of leather soles on old floorboards, the flick of a knife slipping from sleeve to palm, and a hand across a mouth before the scream could form. You learned quickly that stabbing was a messy, clumsy affair. Blades caught in ribs. People didn't die quietly. They thrashed. They bled too much or not enough. Some stared at you even as life left them, and you always remembered the eyes. There was no time to look back. You wiped your knife on your cloak, or you didn't. If time was short, you moved fast. Not elegant, fast. Because within minutes, someone would notice the silence, or the blood, or the fact that the Baron never came down for his evening wine. Escape wasn't an afterthought. It was part of the kill. The passage through the larder, the stable door left unlatched, the old tunnel beneath the orchard wall. You rehearsed them in your head 1,000 times, and still, your heart beat so hard it drowned out every sound. You didn't feel triumph. You felt survival, and then you ran. Always disguises in the Middle Ages weren't clever. They were pathetic. A different hat, a smudge of ash on your face, a borrowed cloak from a corpse still warm in a ditch. There were no rubber masks or master forgers. You became invisible by looking like everyone else, poor, dirty, tired, and unimportant. In the city, you might pose as a tanner's apprentice. Your hands would stink of animal fat and lie open with fresh blisters. In the countryside, you could pass as a traveling monk, muttering fake prayers and wearing a robe stiff with old sweat. Even a shepherd's disguise worked, as long as you remembered to limp and curse about wolves in the hills. The key was to be forgettable. No bright colors, no weapons in view, no eye contact. You walked with the slouch of someone who had no opinions and no news worth sharing. You always carried a fake name, and sometimes you forgot which one you'd given to which village that could get you killed. There were no ID cards, but people noticed details: a missing finger, an odd accent, the way you cut your bread. You had to constantly rewrite yourself. You weren't just hiding from your enemies, you were hiding from yourself. Sometimes the disguise lasted weeks. You'd embed into a castle's staff, serving trenchers in the great hall, while pretending not to overhear the baron's secrets. You learned how to scrape plates without gagging, how to nod like a good servant, how to make yourself useful without being remembered. But these lives wore you down. You started dreaming in other people's voices. You forgot what your real laugh sounded like. Sometimes you even caught yourself believing the lies, that you really were a carpenter's apprentice, that you really were a man of God. Then came the mission, and the illusion shattered with blood. Even children could be dangerous. They remembered too much. A boy who saw you changing clothes. A girl who noticed you asking the wrong question. If they spoke, your disguise unraveled, and the village that once ignored you turned fast into a mob. You learned never to be kind, never to stay too long, never to let anyone get close. You walked the line between actor and ghost, praying no one looked too hard. You weren't clever, you were lucky, and luck always ran out. You worked alone, not by choice, but by design. No guild, no brotherhood, no team to cover your back when things went sideways, and they always did. Other assassins were competition, not comrades. If you met another like yourself, you didn't share stories, you shared tension. To ghosts passing in opposite directions, each hoping the other kept walking. Trust was a luxury you couldn't afford. Informants betrayed for coin. Clients turned on you when the job was done. The man who gave you the tip-off could also give your name to the city guard the moment he got nervous. You lived as if the walls had ears, because often they did. And even if you wanted companionship, you couldn't keep it. You avoided eye contact in taverns, never drank more than a sip, never shared where you were going next. Intimacy was a threat. It opened doors to questions. Questions led to patterns, and patterns led to people hunting you down with dogs and torches. On the rare occasion you did team up, it was temporary and transactional. A lookout, maybe, a smuggler to help you cross a river. But these alliances ended the moment coin changed hands. No goodbyes, no thanks, just two people walking away, praying they wouldn't be the next job. Even your weapons kept you company in silence. You sharpened your knife with the care of a priest polishing relics. It was your only constant. You'd whisper to it, not out of madness, but ritual. A way to stay tethered to something when nothing else felt real. The blade never lied. It didn't gossip or plot. It simply did what you asked, and in return, it demanded only that you keep it clean. You couldn't afford illness. A cough could give you away. A fever could slow you down. There were no doctors you could trust. No safe house with warm blankets and stew. If you got sick, you curled up in a hayloft, trembling, praying you'd live through the night. Most of the time, you didn't. And through all this, the hunger, the paranoia, the wounds that never healed quite right, you had no one to talk to, no one to confess to. You kept your stories in your head, replaying them like broken songs, editing out the screams until you convinced yourself it had all gone smoothly. But deep down, you knew the truth. You weren't a ghost. You were just a man waiting to be caught. Planning a kill wasn't a matter of hours. It was days, sometimes weeks, living in mud and shadows, your stomach growling louder than your thoughts. You didn't sit at a desk sketching maps. You sat in doorways, listened through cracks in stone, watched the habits of a man who never knew he was being hunted. You noted everything, the way he scratched his ear when nervous, the time he rose from supper, how often he visited the chapel, whether he preferred wine or mead. You learned a man's life intimately, and then you ended it as if it meant nothing. You couldn't afford to improvise. The consequences of failure were too permanent. You had to know who was where and when. When the guards changed shifts, when the cook left the door open, when the dogs were fed and when they weren't, you moved in a maze of human behavior, memorizing the rhythm until you could walk it blind. Sometimes the plan required misdirection. A cart tipped in the market to draw attention. A fire in a haystack that would send the manor's men running. You didn't strike when it was convenient. You struck when the world was looking elsewhere. And then you got in. The moment of entry was its own kind of madness, crawling through a drainage tunnel that reeked of rot and rats, squeezing through broken roof tiles under a moonless sky, hanging by your fingertips from a ledge while prayers died on your lips. One mistake, and you didn't fall to your death. You fell into the hands of men who'd make you beg for it. Inside, you were nothing more than a shadow. You stepped on rugs, not stone. You avoided eye lines. You crept past sleeping dogs and drunk guards. And all the while, your fingers tightened around the hilt in your sleeve, because you never knew if someone had set a trap just for you. Even the final steps, the ones leading to your mark, were agony. Your heart pounded in your throat. Every creak of the floor felt like thunder. And when you finally stood over the bed, the flicker of candlelight catching the sweat on your brow, there was no thrill, just dread, because you knew what came next. The kill wasn't silent. People died, making sounds that stayed with you, gurgling, whimpering, gasping, and you stood there, holding the knife like a guilty child, waiting to be caught, knowing you couldn't run fast enough if things went wrong. But you ran anyway, always, because staying meant dying. You escaped into darkness like it owed you a favor. There was no applause, no sigh of relief, just the wet slap of your feet on stone and the panic rising in your throat. Every footstep behind you could be pursuit. Every barking dog could mean discovery. You didn't breathe properly until miles separated you from the corpse, and even then, the air felt too sharp. If you were lucky, you'd made it to the edge of the city before the alarm was raised. If not, You ran beneath ringing bells, past men grabbing spears in the night, through streets where your face would be burned into memory if anyone had caught a full glimpse. But you kept moving, not bravely, not confidently, just because stopping meant ropes and knives and screaming crowds. There were no clean getaways. You might dive into a cesspit to escape a pursuer, climb a wall slick with moss and blood, cram yourself beneath floorboards in a stranger's shed while armed men pounded on doors nearby. You didn't escape because you were skilled. You escaped because the world didn't notice you fast enough. Your reward. A purse of coins dropped at a prearranged spot, buried in the roots of a dead tree, or tucked behind a loose stone near a burnt chapel. There was no handshake, no well done, just cold silver, and the understanding that no one owed you anything, least of all gratitude. And then you disappeared again. You changed your name again. You wandered to another village or port, assuming the rumors hadn't outrun your feet. Sometimes you traveled with pilgrims, pretending to seek salvation. Sometimes you signed on as a guard for a merchant caravan, hoping no one recognized your eyes. You stared into campfires with men who might kill you if they knew what you'd done last week. You didn't sleep well, ever. You closed your eyes, but your body remained alert. Every creak, every shifting wind, every cough from a fellow traveler made your hand twitch toward your blade. You slept with your back to walls, with doors blocked by broken chairs, and even then, dreams still came. Faces, blood, the ones who didn't go quietly. You learned quickly not to linger anywhere. Cities were safer when you moved constantly. A familiar face in the wrong alley could unravel everything. A single child saying, "Hey, I know you could become a death sentence." So you became a man without roots, without friends, without the luxury of home. But the worst part wasn't the fleeing. It was the knowing, the constant gnawing in your gut that even if you escaped today, there would always be another job, another name, another silent kill waiting around the next bend. And no matter how fast you ran, you could never outrun yourself. Even if you managed to survive the act, evade the guards, and vanish into the next province, there was a different kind of hunter waiting for you, rumor. In medieval times, gossip traveled faster than carts. A whisper in a market square could become a bounty by nightfall, and soon everyone was looking for a man with eyes like flint or a scar shaped like a crow's foot. Whether it was true or not didn't matter. Once the tale began, it spread like fire through dry brush. You couldn't stop it. People needed stories. They invented the assassin into something terrifying because it made them feel safer. Like evil had a face, a name, and could be hanged. So you became legend to strangers and suspect to everyone. You walked into towns feeling their eyes crawl over you, measuring your gait, your voice, your silence. Eventually, the church caught wind. Not the local priest, the big ones, bishops, inquisitors, men who saw assassins not just as criminals, but heretics. After all, what kind of soul could kill without cause and vanish without confession? They believed you were in league with demons, and some days you feared they might be right. You couldn't walk into a cathedral and kneel for absolution. Confession required truth, and truth got you killed. Even praying felt risky. What if the wrong person overheard your whispered regrets? So instead, you kept your sins in your teeth, grinding them night after night. You tried to forget the names. You tried harder to forget the screams. Sometimes a noble you'd never seen before would stop you on the road and offer coin. "There's a man I need removed. he'd say, casually, as though ordering wine. And the pattern would begin again. The waiting, the kill, the escape. It was a cycle, addictive and stirring. It left you raw, hollow, and more alone with each passing job. But the greatest threat of all wasn't a knight's blade or a city guard's crossbow. It was someone like you. Other assassins worked the same routes, took the same coins, hunted the same targets. You never knew if the man across the tavern was competition or the person hired to clean up after your last job. You once spotted another killer just by the way he stirred his stew, left-handed eyes on the door. You didn't speak, you just left, because you knew how it worked. No witnesses, no loose ends. You had become both. Poison was the fantasy. Everyone thought assassins favored it. Silent, subtle, clean. But the reality, poison, was a nightmare. The wrong dose meant your target lived long enough to speak your name. The wrong delivery meant they choked, vomited, and alerted every soul in the castle. And the worst part, half the time, the poison killed you too. The ingredients were unreliable. Henbane, belladonna, hemlock, plants that could turn a man inside out if measured correctly. But those same plants, picked in the wrong season or ground with the wrong mortar, became nothing more than bitter tea. Apothecaries weren't your friends, and they asked too many questions. So you gathered ingredients yourself, stumbling through woods at night, praying you didn't mix up the deadly with the merely disgusting. Administering it was its own risk. A poisoned cup of wine. What if he didn't drink? What if he passed it to someone else first? A laced meat pie. What if the dog got to it? Sometimes you tried to brush it onto the handle of a goblet or slip it into inkwells. Any route that let you avoid the blade. But nothing ever went to plan. You once waited 3 nights for a noble to take a sip of his own wine. He never did. You left that castle hungrier and more exhausted than when you arrived. And it wasn't elegant. People didn't die quietly from poison. They screamed, they clawed at their throats. Their eyes bulged, their skin flushed purple, and they thrashed hard enough to knock over tables. That sound, the desperate, panicked howling of a man dying from within, haunted you more than any blade ever could. It was a sound you heard again in every silence. Worse, if you carried poison improperly, you died before the mission even began. You couldn't label bottles. You couldn't always seal them well. One cracked vial in your cloak pocket, and your fate was sealed before you reached the gates. You learned to keep the poison away from your skin, your eyes, your lips. You learned this the hard way. Every assassin did. There was a time when you tried to retire poison altogether. Too many close calls, too many mistakes. But then a job came. A man too well guarded, too armored, too careful. No blade would reach him. Only poison could. So you used it again. Because sometimes it wasn't about choice. It was about inevitability. You were a slave to whatever worked, and poison, for all its flaws, sometimes worked. At least when the stars aligned, the target was predictable, and the wind didn't blow your powder back into your own eyes. But that was rare, very rare. When the job was done, truly done, a strange emptiness settled over you. You'd washed the blood from your hands in a stream that stank of dead fish, burned your cloak in a ditch, buried your weapon behind a fallen tree. You'd changed your name again, tied your hair differently, picked up a limp you didn't need, and still you felt exposed. Every peasant who glanced your way could be someone sent to watch you. Every guard on the road could be hunting you. Every cough in the distance made your hand twitch toward a knife that no longer existed. You lived in constant rehearsal, always one lie ahead of discovery. And when you reached the safe house, if there was one, it was never more than a room with no windows and a bolt on the door. The walls leaked, the food was stale, the firewood was wet. You curled up under a ragged blanket, clutching your coin purse like it might buy you absolution. But the worst part wasn't the cold or the hunger. It was the silence. Because in that silence, the kill replayed itself. Not just the act, but the details. The look on the victim's face, the sound their body made as it hit the floor, the way your own breath had caught just before you struck. You remembered their clothes, their scent, even their final words, if they'd had any. And no matter how many times you told yourself it was necessary, the images didn't fade. You couldn't write about it. You couldn't speak of it. You simply carried it like a weight beneath your ribs. Some nights you drank to forget. Other nights you stayed sober to remember, to convince yourself that you weren't a monster. But the line blurred quickly, too quickly. Sometimes you thought about what life might have been without the blade. If you'd been born to a family with land, if you'd taken the cloth, if the war hadn't burned down your village. These thoughts were dangerous. They softened you, and softness was the one thing you couldn't afford. Because the next job would come. They always did. You might be in a tavern, nursing broth, when a man sat beside you and slid a coin across the table. Or maybe it was a letter under your door, or a name whispered in passing by someone who shouldn't have known you existed. The world had a way of pulling you back in, and you would say yes, because it was what you knew, because the coin was good, because deep down you believed it was all you were ever good for, killing, then vanishing, then waiting to be summoned again. There were moments when you felt invincible, not proud, never proud, but untouched. You'd walked past guards with blood on your sleeves and hadn't been stopped. You'd hidden in plain sight during manhunts. You'd taken lives in places so sacred, even your own breath felt like blasphemy. And somehow, you were still breathing. But that feeling never lasted. You began to see signs where there were none. A merchant staring too long. A stable boy who ran the moment he saw your face. A priest who paused too long during a blessing. The world turned paranoid, and so did you. You changed towns weekly. You never returned to the same inn twice. You sat with your back to walls and your fingers close to a blade you swore you wouldn't use again. You became a ghost in your own life. You couldn't form relationships, not real ones. How do you build trust when every sentence you speak is a lie? When every kindness might be remembered by someone who will one day have to deny knowing you? You learned to fake warmth, to laugh at the right time, to nod in the right places, but it was all performance. Deep down, you were always waiting for the day someone recognized you and called for the noose. And still, you tried to carve something human from the ruin. You kept tokens, small, pathetic things. A stone from a village where no one knew your name. A ribbon from a dress worn by someone you almost cared about. A crude drawing of a house you'd never build. They were your resistance, proof that you weren't just a tool with blood-stained hands. But even these small acts of rebellion against your fate carried risk. If someone found them, questions would follow. You aged quickly. Lines etched themselves across your face like scars. Your hands shook, not from fear, but from fatigue. You began to notice you were slower than before, that you made more noise on the stairs, that your knees ached on cold mornings. The world didn't reward aging assassins. It simply stopped offering them jobs and started offering rewards for their heads. You'd hear stories of others like you, caught and flayed, or simply vanishing, their bodies never found. And you wondered, would anyone notice if you disappeared? Would anyone mourn? Or would your absence just be another whispered rumor in some dim tavern? You weren't afraid of death anymore. You were afraid of dying without ever having lived. You learned to read faces the way others read scrolls, not just for signs of danger, though those were constant, but for something deeper: regret, guilt, suspicion. You could tell when someone was lying. You could tell when someone had killed. And worst of all, you could tell when someone recognized you, but didn't yet remember where from. That kind of recognition was the most dangerous. It happened more often with age. Faces blurred across regions. A man you'd passed years ago in a different town might suddenly place your voice, your walk, your eyes. Sometimes they said nothing. Sometimes they followed you. Once, an old soldier stared at you from across a chapel courtyard for nearly an hour before simply walking away. You never knew if he'd go to the guards, so you didn't sleep for 3 nights. Your name, if you even remembered, the one you were born with, had long ceased to matter. You had aliases layered upon aliases, each one with a different story, a different accent, a different gait. You'd become a man of masks, so many that some days you struggled to remember who you were pretending to be. And yet, none of them felt real. You caught yourself lying even when you didn't have to. You told strangers you were from a village that never existed, that your father was a priest, that your sister died in childbirth. Lies spilled out of you as easily as breath. Not because they were necessary, but because truth felt too dangerous to carry. Your identity was nothing more than a shifting cloud, visible but untouchable. And behind it all was the growing suspicion that no one really knew you, not even yourself. You began to seek out the past, even as it threatened you. You visited the ruins of your childhood village, now overgrown with weeds and ghosts. You stood by rivers where you once played as a child, unable to feel the joy that used to live there. These places should have brought peace, but instead, they reminded you of everything you'd lost. Not just family or innocence, but the very idea of normalcy. You watched normal people from afar, a woman braiding her daughter's hair, a farmer laughing with his son, a baker throwing flour at a dog. These simple, forgettable moments were like daggers. You were always on the outside, looking in, a shadow, pretending to be a man. You wondered what your life would have been if fate had turned left instead of right. If someone had helped you when you were young. If someone had forgiven you when you fell. But in the world you lived in, forgiveness was rarer than gold, and far more dangerous to ask for. So you pressed on, because moving was safer than remembering. And still, the next name was coming. There were moments when you told yourself this would be the last job. One more target, one final payment, and then you'd disappear, for good. Buy a piece of land under a false name. Raise chickens, grow old. It sounded absurd, but you clung to it. The dream was never grand. You didn't want riches or power. You just wanted to stop running. But the truth was crueler. There was no last job, because the more people you killed, the more people knew you could. The more efficient your work became, the more your name, or whatever name you used, traveled across regions like a whispered legend. Even if you tried to fade away, someone would always find you. Desperation had a way of sniffing you out. And even if no one came looking, you'd eventually come looking for purpose. Violence, after a while, became the only language you knew. Killing stopped being shocking. It became routine. You didn't flinch anymore. You didn't dream of anything different. The edge of a blade felt more familiar than the warmth of another human hand. Sometimes you envied your targets. Many of them died quickly, unaware. Some had families who would mourn them, graves to be remembered by, songs sung at their funerals. You, on the other hand, would vanish. No one would write a ballad about you. No one would bury you. At best, you'd become a footnote in someone else's cautionary tale. So you began keeping your own records, not names. That was too dangerous. But sketches, notes on towns you passed through, the color of someone's eyes, the way the sea sounded on a particular morning. You etched fragments of life onto scraps of leather, folded and hidden in a pouch tied to your chest. It was your only proof that you existed, that you were more than the shadow they paid to do their dirty work. And still, you killed again, because another job arrived, because you needed coin, because, deep down, you feared that if you stopped moving, if you stopped doing, the silence would finally catch up and you'd be forced to reckon with the weight of everything you'd done. You walked into another town, a stranger once again, face tucked beneath a hood, heart armored against guilt. You sat at a corner table in a dim tavern, and when a hooded figure approached, sliding a folded note across the table, you didn't hesitate. You opened it, you read the name, and without even realizing it, you nodded, just like always. The target this time was a reeve, a land agent for a wealthy lord, hated by peasants, but protected like a prince. He lived behind timbered walls, guarded by men who didn't ask questions, just followed orders. He held feast nights to show off his coin, paraded through town with a sword at his side, and punished beggars for existing. Everyone wanted him gone, but no one dared lift a hand, except you. You spent 3 nights watching the manor from a barn loft, eating moldy bread, and listening to pigs snort beneath you. The reeve took the same path to chapel every morning, always surrounded by guards. But he had a weakness, a mistress who lived in a hidden cottage just outside town. He visited her under cover of darkness. No guards, no page boys, just him and his pride. You followed him one night, trailing his silhouette across frost-bitten fields. He didn't hear you. Few ever did. He reached the cottage, tapped twice on the door, and disappeared inside. You waited in the shadows near a broken fence post, counting the breaths between candle flickers. Then you moved. There was no poetry in what came next. The cottage was small. The woman screamed. The reeve tried to draw his blade, but your dagger was already at his side. You didn't aim for the heart. That was too risky. You slid steel beneath his ribs, up into the lungs. He gurgled. She sobbed. You left them both, not out of mercy, but because time was bleeding. Back into the dark, boots silent on frozen earth, wind biting your face. You retraced your path through the woods, doubled back twice to confuse trackers, then disappeared into the stalls of a local fair as the bells began to ring. Another faceless man among peddlers, jesters, and drunk farmers. The job was done. The reeve was dead, and no one knew who held the blade. That night, you stayed in a hayloft above a stable, watching your breath rise and vanish in the cold air. You didn't sleep. The kill was clean, but the mistress's scream had clung to you, not because it pierced your ears, but because it sounded like someone who once called your name long ago, in a life that felt like a dream. You tightened your cloak. You buried your face in your hands. and for just a moment you wanted to be someone else, anyone else. But morning came, and the fair moved on, and so did you. Some towns remembered too much. You'd arrive thinking yourself a stranger, but find eyes lingering too long. A baker who dropped his tray when he saw your face. A child who whispered to her mother after you passed. You could feel suspicion rising like steam from cobblestones, seeping into every doorway, every alley. In these places, you didn't stay long. You'd spend one night at the edge of town, in a stable or under a ruined arch, then vanish with the first fog. But the worst part wasn't being chased, it was being known. When someone spoke your name, your real name, it felt like being stabbed. Because that name wasn't yours anymore. It belonged to the person you used to be, and that person was dead. Sometimes it was your face that betrayed you. A sketch nailed to a tavern door, a wanted scroll in a magistrate's hand. Rough drawings, but close enough. And close was all it took for frightened men to become brave. For a few coins, even your old friends would sell you out. Loyalty died faster than fear. You changed your appearance constantly, grew your beard, shaved it, darkened your hair with ash, broke your own nose once, just to make the drawings obsolete. Pain was preferable to recognition. You even learned to limp for weeks at a time, switching legs every few days to confuse those who might follow. It worked, sometimes, but it cost you, in bone, in breath, in sleep. There were towns where you were hunted, not with torches and swords, but with silence. No one would serve you food. No one would meet your eyes, doors locked as you passed. Mothers pulled their children close, and in those moments you felt more monster than man. You weren't feared because of what you'd done, but because of what you might do. But the strangest fear came from those who admired you. There were some, too many, who saw you as a myth, a hero cloaked in shadow. They whispered your deeds like stories told by firelight. He killed a baron with a single touch. He vanished from a tower guarded by 20 men. None of it true, but it didn't matter. Legends don't need facts, they need awe. A boy once approached you in a marketplace, wide-eyed, trembling with excitement. "Are you him?" he asked. You said nothing, just turned away. But his voice followed. "I want to be like you." That stayed with you more than any curse or scream, because you knew what becoming you meant. It meant hunger, solitude, blood, the death of everything soft and good inside. And you wouldn't wish that on anyone, especially not a child. Winter was the cruelest companion, not just because of the cold, though it bit through even the thickest wool, but because winter made everything slower. The roads turned to mud or froze solid, your breath visible in the dark, giving you away before your footsteps did. Nothing creaked louder than wood in the frost. Every board groaned, every branch snapped like bones. And in those long, bitter nights, stealth was a fantasy. Food became scarce. You went days without meat, surviving on barley mash or crusts stolen from monastery kitchens. You learned which weeds were edible and which ones made you retch blood. You learned to catch rats and how to boil them until the smell didn't make you gag. Sometimes you traded labor for a bowl of soup. Other times you took it and ran. The cold made your fingers clumsy. Your grip on a dagger was no longer sure. Locks were harder to pick. Climbing walls became a gamble. You slipped once, fell from a second-story ledge, and cracked a rib. You wrapped your chest with torn cloth and kept moving, but breathing felt like punishment for days. Your joints stiffened, knees ached, toes turned purple. You woke up more than once with your hands curled into frozen claws, unable to unclench them for hours. And all the while, the world expected you to keep killing as if nothing had changed, as if your body wasn't falling apart one knuckle at a time. There were no warm fires for men like you, no beds waiting at the end of the job. When you lit a fire, it was in a cave or behind a crumbling wall, its glow hidden behind rocks so it wouldn't give you away. You huddled near it, rubbing your hands, trying to coax feeling back into your skin. But even fire had limits. It warmed your face, not your soul. And still, the jobs came. You once tracked a merchant for 3 nights in a blizzard, every step a guess. His guards huddled around braziers while you lay belly down in snow, watching from the tree line. Your boots were soaked through. Your teeth wouldn't stop chattering. When you finally made your move, your legs nearly gave out, not from fear, but from frost. But you completed the job, slipped away into the whiteness like a ghost, only to collapse in a barn an hour later, barely able to crawl. You lay there shaking, wet, bleeding, unsure if you'd wake again. You did, but something in you didn't. And that was the true cost of winter, not the pain, not the hunger, not even the cold. It was what it stole from inside you. Cities were supposed to be safe, bustling, loud, full of hiding places. But to an assassin, cities were traps. Stone walls narrowed your exits. Watchmen patrolled at every bell. Taverns filled with loose tongues and quick tempers. And the more people packed into tight streets, the more likely someone would recognize your face, your gait, or the way you vanished when questions were asked. You moved like water in the city, flowing through gaps, avoiding pressure. You learned which alleys connected, which gates were least watched, and how to slip through kitchens without notice. City life was noise and chaos. Good cover for the blade, but terrible for escape. A wrong turn could box you in. A closed gate could mean death. You wore the same clothes as laborers, a soot-smeared tunic, a cap pulled low. You carried tools, not weapons, or at least that's what they looked like. A mason's chisel could be a dagger. A bundle of rope might strangle you. Had to blend in with the city's rhythm. Fast, tired, uninterested. But cities had eyes. Children who begged by day and spied by night. Bakers who knew every customer's face. Women who noticed when you never looked them in the eye. Information moved quickly. A suspicious man spotted in the slums could become a wanted poster before sunset. The city watched, and it remembered. Markets were dangerous. Open spaces, nowhere to hide. Yet sometimes you had to go, to listen, to gather rumors, to catch a glimpse of your mark. You stood by carts of dried fish, pretending to compare prices, while your eyes scanned the crowd for a guard's uniform or a flash of steel. You bought nothing. You always left early. Even the rooftops weren't safe. In cities, they were watched by guards, by monks, by other thieves. You once crept along the upper beams of a cathedral only to find a beggar asleep there. He woke, stared, and didn't scream. Just said, "You're not the first to try this," then went back to sleep. You gave him a coin the next day, more than most ever got from you. You avoided temples unless your target was there. Faith was dangerous. You didn't know the prayers, the rites, the posture. A single misstep during a mass could reveal you. But you still went sometimes, just to sit in shadow and listen to the silence between chants. It reminded you there was something beyond the kill, even if it felt distant. City life made your nerves burn. Every knock on a door, every footstep that paused too long outside your window. You never stayed more than a few nights. You never unpacked, and you always knew the fastest way to the roof. Because in a city, you weren't just hunted by law. You were hunted by memory. And memory, once stirred, never went quietly. The noble class feared you, but they also needed you. Their hands were clean, embroidered with rings and prayers. Yours were bloody, and that was the arrangement. You did what they couldn't, what they wouldn't, and in return, they gave you silver. Not safety, not protection, just silver. You met them in secret, behind shrines, in locked cellars, or aboard moored ships at night. Their words were always cloaked in riddles. A thorn in my side. A rival who forgets their place. Never direct, never honest, but you understood. You always understood. That's what made you useful. They spoke of duty, honor, bloodlines, but you saw through it. These weren't holy crusades. These were petty squabbles, jealousies in fine clothing. A baron whose nephew laughed too loud. A bishop whose rival built a larger chapel. A merchant lord who wanted better tariffs. You weren't eliminating evil. You were trimming weeds for the powerful. Sometimes they paid you in advance. Other times they offered land or titles, things you could never claim without revealing yourself. Lies wrapped in velvet. You took them anyway, knowing full well you'd never build a home or sit at a council table. It wasn't about trust, it was about survival. And even then, betrayal was common. One lord had you kill his cousin, then tried to silence you with a squad of men at arms, said you were a bandit. You killed two before escaping into the river, wounds burning, lungs full of filth. Later, you heard he died of poisoning, not by your hand, just fate. You didn't feel satisfaction, just relief that, for once, fate was on your side. Working for nobles meant you were never more than a disposable tool. If you succeeded, they acted as if you'd never met. If you failed, well, there was no second chance. Word spread quickly through those marble halls. You had to disappear before your name curdled in their mouths. And, worst of all, sometimes they sent you after good men. A village leader who defied a corrupt lord. A knight who protected peasants too well. A scholar who knew too much. You told yourself you didn't know the whole story. That maybe there was more than met the eye, but in your heart you knew the truth. You were a knife in their hand, and a knife has no conscience. After each job, you cleaned your blade, not just to protect it, but to forget. You buried the names, burned the letters, walked away before guilt had time to bloom. You convinced yourself it was all necessary. But at night, when the wind howled through the cracks in your shelter, and the moon cast shadows like ghosts across the floor, you wondered if they remembered you, or if they only remembered what you'd done. In every region, there was a different name for what you were. Shadowblade, Nightcrow, God's Finger, Blood Whisper. The names sounded powerful, poetic even, but none of them fit. They made you seem more myth than man, and that was dangerous, because it made people forget what you truly were. Tired, flesh and bone, hunted, hollow. Legends helped you disappear, but they also made the wrong people curious. Bounty hunters, mercenaries, glory hounds, eager to say they'd killed the infamous ghost. They chased shadows, knocked on doors, questioned farmers. Some even got close. One nearly slit your throat in a bathhouse, smiling as he lunged. You killed him with a broken tile. It wasn't graceful, just desperate. Afterward, you stared at your reflection in the steaming water, blood swirling around your face. You didn't see a legend, just a man growing older, more brittle, and more alone. The jobs didn't get easier, they just got quieter. The marks spoke less, the deaths came faster. You didn't plan as carefully anymore. You cut corners, not out of carelessness, out of numbness. It was all becoming routine. Breathe, stalk, strike, flee, fade, repeat. You stopped asking why. Sometimes you didn't even know what the target had done. A name arrived, a coin was promised, and you obeyed. Not for loyalty or ideology, just inertia, like a wheel rolling downhill, unable to stop. There were brief interruptions to the rhythm. A woman who offered you food without asking questions. A child who handed you a flower, not knowing who you were. A priest who looked you in the eye and said, "I see pain there." You never stayed long in places like that. Kindness made you soft, and softness got you killed. But you remembered those faces more than the ones you ended. One night, you shared a fire with a traveling actor who mistook you for a mute farmer. He told stories, wild tales about knights and dragons, fools and kings. You laughed once, silently, and in that moment, you felt something loosen in your chest. He asked your name. You gave him one of the fake ones. He nodded, content. Before dawn, you vanished, leaving a silver coin and a note that simply said, "Keep telling stories. It matters." That was rare. Most nights ended with you curled beneath a half-collapsed roof, listening to dogs bark in the distance, feeling the wind crawl through the holes in your boots. You didn't cry, you hadn't in years, but you missed it, the ability to feel that much. You couldn't even remember the last time someone touched your hand without fear. And in those quiet, cold hours before the sun dared rise, you whispered names to yourself, not of the dead, but of the people you once were, hoping one of them still existed. Some missions took days, others months. You once spent an entire winter shadowing a target across 3 duchies. He changed inns weekly, surrounded himself with guards, traveled in a rolling fortress of wagons and armed riders. It wasn't just caution. He knew someone was after him. He didn't know it was you. So you became part of the scenery, a beggar outside the gates, a butcher's helper in the town square, a drunk asleep by the stables. You followed him without moving, watched his routines from shadows cast by churches and taverns. Your blade stayed sheathed, but your mind was sharp every hour. It had to be. One slip, one stare too long, and it was over. You finally struck on the 3rd week of Lent. The guards had grown bored. The man had grown careless, and you had grown patient. He drank too much mead at a gathering, stumbled back to his room alone. You were already there, under the bed. You didn't savor the kill. There was no ceremony, just a quiet drag of steel and a stifled gasp. The moment passed like smoke. By the time the first scream rose, you were already gone, hood soaked with snow, vanishing down an alley none of them knew existed. It wasn't pride you felt, it was emptiness. You were starting to wonder if there was even a difference. The long jobs aged you, not in body, though that too, but in soul. You saw so much of the world and touched none of it. Fields of lavender you couldn't stop to smell. Fairs you passed through like a ghost. Laughter that echoed without meaning. Even your footsteps felt detached, as though they belonged to someone else, someone who had once wanted more than this. You kept to the edges of places, avoided fires where men told stories and shared bread. You stopped speaking for days at a time. At first, it was to stay unnoticed. Then it became habit. Silence had become your true language. And yet, sometimes, the world cracked through. A child laughed behind a cart, chasing a wooden hoop. A baker hummed a lullaby that sounded like something your mother once sang. A dog licked your hand when you knelt to tighten a bootstrap. These things, small, accidental, struck harder than blades, because they reminded you there was still softness in the world, and that you had none left. You thought maybe, if you lived long enough, you'd see peace, a true one, a morning without fear, a bed you didn't have to leave before dawn. But peace wasn't made for men like you. It was something you protected for others, and would never taste yourself. So you kept walking, because stopping meant feeling, and feeling was far worse than killing. There were rules, even for people like you. Not written ones, those belonged to kings and clerics. Yours were the kind you carved into memory through scars, rules that kept you breathing. Never take a job too close to your last. Never kill a man whose face you've seen more than twice. Never promise what you can't escape. And never, never ask about the reason. You broke one of those rules once. The client was a woman, dressed well, not noble, but educated. Her voice was calm, her words careful. She gave you a name, a location, a pouch of coin, standard. But when you looked at her, truly looked, there was something in her eyes, something that didn't fit. So you asked, softly, why this man? She paused, not surprised, not afraid, just sad. He killed my son, she said. Not in war, not by accident, for sport. And for a moment, you felt justified, righteous even. You still took the job, you still made the kill. But the feeling didn't last, because justice, you learned, was just another word for revenge with better clothes. And your blade didn't care about motives. It cut the same either way. That kill haunted you longer than most, not because it was difficult. He died before he knew you were there. But afterward, when you looked at the lifeless body, when you remembered her face, something in your chest shifted. You realized you weren't the judge, just the executioner, a tool wielded by anyone who paid enough. There was no honor in it, no truth, just transaction. You stopped asking why after that. It wasn't a rule now. It was instinct. The more you knew, the heavier it became, and you were already drowning. Sometimes you dreamed of your own death, not in fear, but in curiosity. Would it be fast? Would anyone find your body? Would the world notice? You imagined a nameless grave beneath a tree, maybe with a stone, if someone remembered. Probably not. You once told yourself you'd choose the time and place, that no one would take that from you. But in truth, you knew death rarely asked permission. It came, like everything else, unannounced, uncaring, inevitable. And so you made a different vow. If it came suddenly, violently, you would not beg, not for mercy, not for remembrance, not for anything. You'd simply close your eyes and vanish the way you'd lived, alone, silent, and forgotten by design. Because, in the end, what else could a man like you hope for? Certainly not redemption, certainly not peace, maybe just an end. Every assassin eventually asks the same question. How many is too many? You didn't keep a tally, not at first. You told yourself it was better not to know, that names were just names, and numbers just wind. But over time, the faces returned, uninvited, unrelenting, not in the day, when you were sharp and guarded. But at night, in dreams, they didn't scream, they didn't accuse, they just stared, silent, patient. Some you remembered in vivid detail, the tilt of their chin, the color of their cloak, the way their lips parted in surprise. Others were blurs, bodies without context, but they all shared one thing: they knew you, even if you'd tried to forget them. And in those dreams, they waited, as if they knew you'd join them soon. You started counting then, quietly, in your head. 1 with the broken lantern, 2 in the vineyard, 3 by the river, 4 the boy who shouldn't have been there, 5 the priest whose sin you never confirmed. The number grew. You stopped around 30. It wasn't helping. Instead, you tried to forget. Again, you drank more than you should. You walked longer each day. You picked fights in taverns just to feel something familiar that wasn't guilt. And yet, no matter how far you wandered, the weight never lightened. It clung like damp wool, heavy, itchy, always there. One winter, you met an old woman who claimed to be a healer. She offered you tea and silence. No questions, just warmth. You stayed 3 nights, the longest you'd remained anywhere in months. She didn't ask your name. She didn't need to. On the last night, she sat across from you and said, "You carry too many ghosts." You didn't answer. She reached across the fire and touched your hand. Her skin was like paper. "Some burdens," she whispered, "aren't meant to be carried forever." You nodded, but you didn't believe her. Still, for a moment, something inside you cracked, just a little. Then morning came. You left before she woke. You didn't want to know if her kindness had cost her anything. You returned to the road. Your only companion, silence. Your only destination, away. And the ghosts, they followed, always, because no one walks that path without shadows. Not even the ones who think they've outrun them. Sometimes, you tried to remember who you were before the blade, not your name that had faded long ago, but something deeper. The shape of your laughter, the sound of your voice when it wasn't whispering threats or lies. A time when your hands didn't tremble unless you were cold. But memory is cruel when all it has to feed on is blood. You remembered vague things, a field with wildflowers, a sister maybe, or a friend with a crooked smile, a game played with sticks that turned into swords, and then fire, screams, smoke rising where your home once stood. The moment everything changed wasn't loud. It wasn't some grand betrayal. It was silence, the kind that follows loss so complete it steals even the will to scream. You didn't choose the path of the assassin. It simply opened beneath your feet, and you fell, and you kept falling. Training didn't happen in temples or under the watchful eye of masters like the tales. You learned from hunger, from failure, from pain. A thief showed you how to walk without sound. A drunk taught you how to strike a neck so the voice never came. A dying man taught you how to vanish with coins still wet with blood. There was no school, no honor, just survival. And once you knew how to survive, others noticed. They gave you tasks, then names, then payments, and little by little, the old you was carved away until all that remained was the knife and the will to use it. Even now, when you passed a mirror, a real one, rare as they were, you barely recognized the face staring back. Eyes hollowed, cheekbones sharp, a jaw always clenched. You touched your reflection once, just to see if it would flinch. It didn't. There were times when you wanted to stop, to lay down your weapons. to melt into the life of a fisherman or a mason or some lonely hermit in the hills. But you knew it was a lie, because the world didn't let people like you retire. There was always someone who remembered, someone who needed a problem solved, someone who whispered your name even if they never knew it. And so you kept going, not because you wanted to, but because the alternative was standing still. And standing still meant the past would catch you. So you walked through rain, through snow, through the years, until the man you used to be was nothing more than smoke in the distance. The worst jobs weren't the bloodiest. They were the ones that left nothing behind. No coin, no name, no reason. Just a corpse and a silence that didn't feel victorious. It felt unfinished. You once took a contract from a hooded man in a tavern deep in some borderland where languages mixed and loyalties shifted like river tides. He gave no name, only gold. Told you the mark wore red, had a limp, and passed through town every third day at dusk. No motive, no explanation, just red, limp, dusk. You waited 3 days, then 6. Watched the road, counting the hours with knots in a cord. On the 9th day he came, limping, cloak red, face unreadable. You did what you were paid for, fast, clean, unseen. And then you learned he was a healer, carried herbs from village to village, helped the sick for free, limped from an old wound, saving a child from a collapsing bridge. There was no way to take it back. You didn't return to collect the rest of the coin. You left the town before the body was found. For weeks after, you walked without purpose, eyes on the dirt, fingers clenching and unclenching at your sides. Every act of kindness you saw, a woman feeding stray dogs, a boy giving a blanket to a beggar, scraped at the guilt like rust on a blade. You wanted to believe he'd done something horrible, that he was hiding some dark truth. But deep down, you knew the truth. Someone had wanted him gone, and you had made that happen. That was the thing about your line of work. It never gave you closure. Even when the job was done, the echoes remained. Sometimes they came in dreams. Sometimes they came in faces that looked too similar. Once they came in a song, a traveler humming a tune the healer had been whistling just before you struck. It shattered you, not all at once, but like frost cracking wood over time. You started to question every contract, every whisper in the dark, every bag of silver tossed across a table. You weren't becoming soft, you were becoming haunted. So you stopped killing for a while, tried to disappear, tried to be no one. But the world didn't let you go, not really. Requests still found their way to you. Coins in hidden places. Notes slipped under doors. Promises of payment and silence. You ignored them at first, but coin meant food. Coin meant shelter. Coin meant safety, even if temporary. And so, when the hunger returned, when the ache in your bones became louder than your conscience, you accepted another job. Just one, then another, and another, until the guilt faded again into routine. Because the truth was simple. You didn't know how to live without the killing. And that scared you more than anything. Sometimes you passed other killers. Not often, but it happened. A certain walk, a certain stillness, a lack of blinking that marked a man who'd seen too much and said too little. You didn't exchange names, didn't nod, but you both knew. One night, in a burned-out village near the edge of a warring province, you shared a fire with one. He looked older, but it was hard to say by how much. His hands shook when he held his knife, but his eyes, they didn't flinch, not even when a scream echoed through the distant trees. You didn't talk for hours. Then, as the fire died down, he said, "It doesn't leave you, does it?" You didn't need to ask what he meant. He went on, "The first one, maybe. You think it's about justice, or necessity, or vengeance. The last one, that's the lie that lasts the longest. But after a while, it's just a rhythm. One foot, one step, one cut." You asked him why he still did it. He stared into the embers. "Because I forgot what else I could be." And that was the truth of it, wasn't it? The longer you walked this path, the narrower it became, until it wasn't a path at all, just a ledge with no way back. You had no skills fit for peace, no family waiting, no land to return to. You couldn't even picture yourself as a blacksmith, or a farmer, or a merchant. Your hands weren't built for creating, only ending. You envied men with simple lives, the cooper shaping barrels, the tanner scraping hides, even the drunk who swept stables just for a place to sleep. They had places in the world, places where they were wanted, needed. You didn't. You were useful, yes, but only in secret, only in silence, and always with the understanding that once your usefulness ended, so did your value. That old man by the fire, you woke to find him gone. No footprints, no ash disturbed. For a moment, you wondered if he'd even been real, or just another ghost sent to remind you how this story ends. Because in your heart, you already knew. There is no retirement for men like you. No final job. No safe house in the woods with a garden and a dog and someone who says your name without flinching. There's only the next name, the next night, and the thin hope that maybe, just maybe, your end will come quickly, quietly, and without anyone around to ask why. Because questions were heavier than swords, and answers, they were always too late. Every assassin dreams of vanishing. Not into the shadows, that was routine, but truly vanishing, disappearing from history. No more names, no more contracts, no more whispers in alleyways or knockings at midnight. You fantasized about it, a cabin near a quiet river, far from the lords and lies, a place where no one knew your face, where you could wake to birdsong and sleep without a dagger under your pillow. But fantasies like that don't survive long in your line of work, because people don't let go of their monsters. The ones who hired you would wonder where you'd gone. The ones who feared you would send others to confirm it. The world didn't trust men like you to simply fade. If you weren't active, you were a liability, a secret waiting to be sold or exposed. You tried once. Spent half a year tending sheep under a false name in a forgotten valley. The rhythm was strange at first, too quiet, too soft, but your hands adjusted, your breath slowed. You even laughed once, watching two lambs chase a chicken. It felt real, until a rider came through town, asking questions. Not about you, not directly, but you saw the way he lingered. The way he studied faces, the way his hand never strayed far from his belt. You didn't wait. That night, you packed everything you owned, a knife, a water skin, and a bundle of coins, and walked away from the quiet life you'd almost allowed yourself to believe in. You never even said goodbye to the old man who had offered you shelter, or the girl at the market who smiled when she handed you bread. You couldn't risk leaving traces. The next village didn't know your name, and you didn't learn theirs. You told yourself it was better this way. But each time you ran, a little more of you stayed behind, in doorways, in footpaths, in the kind of laughter you didn't know how to carry with you. Some nights, You sat by the road and watched fires flicker in distant windows, wondering what it felt like to be inside, to be part of something, to belong. But you knew better. The fire would always burn too hot for someone like you. It wasn't that you didn't deserve peace. It was that peace didn't know what to do with you. So you kept walking toward the next name, the next shadow, the next silence. Because the life you'd built wasn't made of stone or soil or memory. It was made of exits. And every time you found a door, you already knew it wouldn't stay closed for long. Some called you a sinner, others a necessary evil. A few, quietly, called you a hero, though never to your face. But none of them knew the truth. You weren't any of those things. You were a consequence, a symptom of a world built on betrayal, power, and fear. You didn't create the cruelty. You adapted to it, molded yourself to survive it. And in doing so, you became what others feared most. A man with no allegiance, no hesitation, and no face worth remembering. There was a strange kind of freedom in that. You didn't owe the world anything. No debts, no explanations, no legacy. But there was a cost. When a man dies without attachments, there are no tears. No one writes songs or lights candles. His story ends without echo. No student, no sun, no grave with flowers, just wind. You once met a man who claimed to have known your father. He spoke in riddles, the way drunk old men do when they've lived too long. He said your father had once been brave, once stood against corruption. Said he remembered a boy with wild eyes and scraped knees, who never backed down from a fight. You didn't respond because you didn't want to remember. Because remembering meant mourning something you never truly had. You killed the man 2 nights later, not because he posed a threat, but because he knew too much. And the more a man knows about you, the less you sleep. The truth is, you feared memory more than steel. Wounds healed, regret festered, and when you're alone long enough, even the sound of your own thoughts becomes dangerous. So you filled the silence with movement, with routine, with the rhythm of footsteps and the careful check of hidden blades. Some days you imagined what it might be like if things had gone differently, if you'd been born to a different life. A life where you learned to read before you learned to kill. Where you chased love instead of shadows. But those thoughts never stayed long. Not because you didn't want them, but because you didn't trust yourself to want them. The path you walked had no forks, and even if you tried to turn back, there was nothing waiting behind you. Only the echo of your own footsteps and the ghosts you left behind. There were rumors, always rumors, about a secret order of assassins. Men and women who moved like mist, trained from childhood, bound by oaths written in blood and sealed by fire. The kind of tales whispered by candlelight in taverns, while drunks leaned in, wide-eyed, and clutched their tankards tighter. You knew the truth. There was no great brotherhood, no hidden fortress carved into a mountain, no sacred code. There were just people, desperate, broken, sharpened by pain and circumstance. The fantasy was easier to believe. People wanted to think that killers were different from them, that you were some other species, born in shadow, raised on venom, too close. You met a man once who claimed to be from such an order. He wore dark robes, moved like a ghost, spoke in riddles. But when you watched him fight, really fight, you saw hesitation, the kind that gets men killed, the kind that said his stories were stitched together from books and lies. He didn't survive the night, not because you killed him. Even in death, he wore the mask of a myth. And that was the problem with legends. They attracted the wrong kind of attention. You never wanted to be a legend. Legends had weight, expectations. People projected things onto them. Justice, vengeance, prophecy. You didn't want any of it. You didn't even want your name remembered. And the truth was this: being a killer was never noble, never elegant. It was cold hands in colder rooms. It was choosing to live one more day at the cost of another's breath. It was dirt under your nails and sweat between your shoulder blades and blood that never quite washed out. It wasn't glory. It wasn't honor. It made the world seem structured, even in its violence. But you knew better. The real blade was quiet, ugly, lonely, and it left you wondering, more often than not, if perhaps the people you killed had it easier than you. Because their pain ended, yours just lingered. Time is strange when you live in the margins. Seasons pass without celebration. Years fold into one another. Faces blur. Towns blend. You remember 1,000 rooftops, but not a single roof of your own. You know the price of silence in 3 different currencies, but can't recall the sound of your own name spoken kindly. You aged without noticing. One morning, you caught your reflection in a puddle and saw silver in your beard, wrinkles around your eyes that hadn't been there before, scars you didn't remember earning. And in that moment, you realized you had outlived most men like you. Not because you were better, but because you were lucky. And luck runs out. There was no retirement plan for assassins, no pension, no land deed. You wouldn't grow old, surrounded by grandchildren, or sit by a fire, retelling stories with a mug in hand. If you lived long enough, your body would simply fail at the wrong moment. A slip, a cough, a missed heartbeat, and that would be it. You once saw an old killer die in a tavern brawl, not on a mission, not at the hands of a king's guard. Just a punch from a drunk farmer who didn't know who he was. That's how fast it all ends. Not with ceremony, but with accident. And maybe that was fitting, because your life was never built for legacy. You'd tried to write once, a letter, nothing grand, just a few lines meant to explain yourself, to confess, maybe, but the words didn't come. What could you possibly say? That you were sorry, that you never meant to become what you did. Even if you found the words, who would you send them to? There was no one left, just acceptance. Would they tell stories about your silence, your eyes, the way you never missed? Would they lie and call you a shadow when you were only ever a man? You hoped not. You didn't want to be feared anymore, just forgotten, because in forgetting there was mercy. And after everything, maybe that's all you deserved. And yet, despite everything, despite the scars, the silence, the weight of every name you never spoke aloud, there were still moments that reminded you of your humanity. A child waving at you from a field, not knowing who you were. A bird landing beside you as you sharpened your blade, unafraid. A woman humming in a market, her voice drifting on the wind like something holy. These moments didn't last, but they were real. And they reminded you that beneath the layers, the masks, the kills, the distance, there was still a heartbeat. You didn't go there to pray. You didn't believe you were worthy of prayer. But something drew you inside. You sat, not in a pew, not before the altar, just on the ground, near a cracked wall where moss grew through stone, and you were still. No thoughts of escape, no plotting. No fear, just silence, true silence. It didn't last, nothing ever did, but it mattered. Because in that single moment, you were not a killer. You were simply a man tired of running, tired of hiding, tired of being the blade in someone else's hand. You left before sunset, didn't look back, didn't take anything. You didn't need to. The moment had already carved itself into you. Coins still clinked, but from choice. Because even a man like you, made of ghosts and regret, could find a sliver of peace in the cracks of the world, even if it wasn't meant to last. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. The road never ends, not really. It twists, vanishes, reappears in another forest, another village, another set of eyes that avoid yours as you pass. You will not be mourned by loved ones. There will be no songs written about you that tell the truth, only the myths, the ghost stories, the warnings whispered to frightened squires and curious children. But even myths fade. One day, someone will ask what happened to him, and the answer will be a shrug, a guess, a silence. And in that forgetting, you will finally have peace. Maybe in the woods, beneath a sky full of stars. Maybe no one will find your body at all, just your cloak folded over your pack, a dagger missing from its sheath, a final breath released to the trees. And maybe that's how it should be, because you never belonged to anyone. You never asked for remembrance. You asked only for the chance to survive one more day. And you got more than you expected. Far more, you think, in that final moment. Whenever it comes, you might smile. Not out of joy, but out of release. The long run, the endless edge, the shadows behind every door, finally all gone. And someone else, somewhere, will pick up a blade, begin their own descent. A gentler one, a path with light, not yours. Because the truth is simple and cruel. It sucked to be a medieval assassin. Not because of the danger, not because of the loneliness, but because, in the end, it turned you into something you never wanted to be. Invisible in a world you once longed to be seen by. But now, as this tale closes and the night settles once more, you can finally rest, and so can we. Thank you for walking with us through this dark and heavy tale. If you found something meaningful in this quiet journey, something worth remembering, even in the stillness, we invite you to stay close. Subscribe to Medieval Nocturnes, where the forgotten stories come alive again, not in glory, but in truth, and in the hush of candlelight and midnight thoughts. Until next time, dim the lights, ease the breath, and drift into a sleep where no shadows follow. Good night.